in sync and in balance. So let's move on to startup ecosystems. To break that down and look at some of the fundamental pieces. So now we have moved from looking at the startup company and the structure and the terminology, get the clarity on that, looking at the startup journey, the development phases, the key aspects of how they develop and what they need to focus on developing in balanced manner. And now, with that thought process and framework in mind, we'll start looking at the startup ecosystem. So the main challenge with startup ecosystems are that if we look at them at the very early maturity level, when people start to become familiar with the ecosystem term, they start to understand the concept, and they start to look at the ecosystem, the first feelings that almost everyone gets, regardless whether they're startup or support function or mentor or whatnot, that it's a very confusing, like there's like feeling that there's a lot, and at the same time it's very unclear, like what is the connection with each, what is the relationship with each, and so forth. So a big part of startup ecosystem development, in addition to thinking of what do we need in our ecosystem, is to actually take index of that and really get more visual understanding and more proper structural understanding of what that ecosystem actually looks like and how it actually functions. And when we talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and startup ecosystems, we go through this the visualization exercise to really go through this. So when we talk about typical old school innovation in a bigger corporation, R&D side, and then on the other side we have entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial people. So these two functions have typically lived much more separate from each other. They have always, of course, coexisted as well, but looking at that mega trend and shift of the old world and the new world, we have the innovation ecosystem that is an ecosystem of its own, of course, because the innovations are products, like from technology transfer to one company to multiple companies and so forth, or research, and someone else takes that research, does something for that, moves that forward, eventually it matures through, it can be an open source product or whatnot. So innovation can live in its own ecosystem, and there is an innovation ecosystem separately to conceptually understand. The same goes for the entrepreneurship ecosystem, the entrepreneurship, the talent, and so forth. And in the innovation ecosystem side, we have talent, we have theoretical models, scientists, research. On the business side, we have attorneys, so business side also represents market side. We have analysts, experts, planners, corporate people, attorneys, just to kind of give a flavor. There's of course much more, and these are not any specific titles or such. And then on the entrepreneurship ecosystem, that of course also covers much broader scope of entrepreneurs than just startups. So we have generally, before they become officially entrepreneurs, registered entrepreneurs or companies, we have risk takers, doers, makers, multi-talents. We have then when there's more on the market side, we have consultants, we have designers, we have developers, we have like all kinds of business hustlers. So we have all types of different entrepreneurs exercising their entrepreneurial skills and opportunities at different scale, from practical skills to different types of lifestyle businesses. And when we combine these two ecosystems, when we start to look at innovation ecosystem and entrepreneurship ecosystem together, the startups are what is the combining factor. It's the best ingredients from both worlds. If optimally, we just theoretically consider it's like the optimal combination of best ingredients from both these worlds. Best findings, best ideas, best research combined with best market knowledge, combined with entrepreneurial skill set, motivation, energy, activity, and then skill sets to combine and form startups. So other ingredients for startups we have, then in these roles we have big companies can contribute resources. We have advisors, mentors from bigger companies or outside of them. We have experts on specific knowledge from technology side, from market knowledge side. We have talent, we have research, we have patents, other IPR, teachers, ideas, problems, ambitions, visions. So these are the typical ingredients that we can see. And really the point here is that a startup as its own separate legal entity that is being created encapsulates the innovation potential and entrepreneurial drive and team effort, not individuals, but team effort in the separate own legal entity that becomes the startup. And this is the connection where we talk more broadly about innovation entrepreneurship. So we talk about the innovation on its own, we talk about the entrepreneurship on its own, innovation entrepreneurship, and then the form of how that goes to market is a startup, because that's the separate legal entity that encapsulates both of these two elements into a understandable and investable format. So each of these ecosystems overlap. They are not like clearly divided areas. They are all overlapping, but this is the point to communicate how conceptually they can be better identified and separated, but also understanding of to help making sure where the resources should be looked at and how do we kind of think what belongs into our area and what doesn't belong into our area. And this is not to put this in any order of importance or practice or priority. This is just to put them in a context of conceptual framework. So startup ecosystem, it's the most attractive items from innovation ecosystem. It's the most ambitious people from the entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's all the services, activities, items, and people that are part of the startup growth journey. And those all combined are the startup ecosystem in a nutshell. So this is the part that will focus specifically. And on the background, we have the startup development phases as the overall framework. So when we look at them in general, so startups are seeding within innovation entrepreneurship ecosystems being influenced and fed by both ecosystems' best ingredients. And on those development phases, on the higher level, we have these three key areas: formation, validation, and growth. And this is breaking this framework now in the context of ecosystem to really see that what are we looking that we are producing. And I'm just using these analogies to communicate the concepts. Like if we think ecosystem as a factory, we have the factory as a whole, like the ecosystem, and somewhere there in the factory is the assembly line, and that is the assembly line is where the startups go through from service to mature. Outside of the service, the factory line, you have like remote setups that feed that different elements on the factory line. So this is the analogy to get in the head. But the big difference is that that factory is not to be owned, it's not to be controlled. It's not to be controlled, and there are many actually production lines there, and they cross-cut and so forth. But for the sake of analogy, it's good to understand that that there is an input and there is combined processes connecting to each other, and there's an output, which is the scale-ups of the growing companies, and the inputs are ideas and talent. So a startup is born when the IPRs and the founding entrepreneurial team members commit to contribute to build the value and confirm this value to be captured to a company with the founder's shareholder agreement. So there is some document, typically a shareholders agreement, that defines what are the IPRs, what the company owns that the founders contribute, who are the team members, like who are the actual names, like how many shares do they own, what is the ownership percentage. So all of those are like documented that there actually is a startup. Before there is a shareholder agreement created, it's just a vague concept. Even if people talk about there's a team, but if there is no agreement, there is no team. Validation, a startup is ready for growth after the core team's ability and commitment to build and execute the vision is validated, and product have clear customer and market validation. So the validation phase is not only to validate the actual innovation in a form of service or product, but it's also to validate the team's ability and capability to execute and push that product and push that innovation to the markets. So validation is both for the market side and for the organization side. And the growth area is about scaling and multiplying all required things that are validated to work in most efficient manner, while having clear methods in place to actively measure and validate the scaling process and overall progress. So the growth becomes all about converting all of that knowledge that is created at the validation phase and scaling through a means of more team members and putting processes in place, replicating and scaling the business model that works. So these are the three key areas to look at, and it is important that the services that are meant for the validation phase are targeted for companies that are actually ready for the validation phase, and same that they are ready for the growth phase. So it's important to find the right match with the services and the companies. But with this lens, we can really see ecosystem as a funnel. So the analogy from the factory product line, but when we convert that more into more open concept, we have the ability to look at through a lens of funnel. And in this funnel, we can then start really measuring the effectiveness of the ecosystem by looking at how much of that funnel flow do we actually have in our ecosystem, and how does the flow look like over a period of time from the lens of individual companies, from the lens of category of companies, from the companies that were started in a specific year, looking at 3 years later, and so forth. And with that, we can also look at what type of support services we actually have there to support these volumes, and we can get the sense of the measurability of the ecosystem. And we have collected here a number, a statistical average from multiple different sources to validate that we have a roundabout numbers to indicate what type of conversions and what type of indicators we typically are looking at to get a funnel through how many ideas and people and teams and types of companies we need to push through to get a significant scale-up company. And this is more to give a simulation perspective into when you look at your own ecosystem from this perspective, how does these numbers look like? And if you think of how much you want to get per year, then what type of support levels should actually be in place. And of course, it's not that startups can't build everything on their own without any support. Of course they can, but most likely if they feel that kind of ecosystem, they most likely move to an ecosystem where the support does exist. So it's not to say that support is there to create startups. It is to inspire and support, and there's many ways to contribute for that. But of course, it's the entrepreneurs who actually build the startups, but the environment matters significantly. And the typical organizations in an ecosystem include universities, advisory and mentoring organizations, incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, service providers, typically in the form of private small companies, consulting, accounting, legal. Many of these organizations also themselves provide events, but then there are separately those who just provide events. There are startup competitions, investor networks, VC companies, crowdfunding platforms, other funding providers, public grants, loans, startup blogs, business media that focuses also in innovations and new companies, economic development entities, and other related facilitators and stakeholders. And it's important to understand that the ecosystem is actually to look at all of them and not only look at university as an ecosystem or looking at one event organizer as an ecosystem. They are all communities, and they may have, depending on the size, of course, they can have their own ecosystem as well, where that includes multiple different things. But when we look at startup ecosystems as a whole, we need to take into account all of the different organizations, actors, and services that contribute for the whole life cycle of the companies, from before they are companies to when they are becoming significant bigger companies already. And maybe here also, for sake of clarity, also some of these terms that come from startup world, like the incubator and accelerator, is one of the phrase where there can be a lot of inconsistency on what does an incubator actually look like in one ecosystem versus in another, and even more so with accelerators, like there is also definition for what accelerator is that has been created by the consortium of accelerators, because there is sometimes those who call themselves accelerators that are just incubators that change their names, but their functions didn't really change. And accelerator is a relatively new term, but it's not for our job to say what is right or what is wrong, but to just highlight these different aspects that sometimes just because someone says they are something doesn't necessarily resonate with someone who is looking for accelerator, and then they come across something that doesn't match their understanding of what accelerators actually should be doing. So these misguided terminology compared to what is a market average should be one of the areas to really pay attention as well. Ecosystem roles. So we have, of course, entrepreneurs and future entrepreneurs. So the upcoming talent. We have startups and ideas. We have team members. So another form of talent coming upstream. We have potential team members. We have ecosystem organizations. own operative people, so we have support functions, mentoring, organization, advisory, and we have all kinds of people there coordinating and supporting these organizations, functions that also are directly interacting with startups. We have experts and advisors, investors of various types, and then we have inventors, so those who don't even care to take their products any further, but they are just happy creating new potential innovation in the form of inventions. We have innovators, similar, that they like to create ideas and they maybe like to throw them to a certain point, but they don't really necessarily want to push them forward, or they do. They are more want to see some of their innovations more in the market. You have mentors, researchers, supporters, other entrepreneurial people that are really proactive and engaging in the ecosystem support, but not necessarily entrepreneurs, or don't even necessarily want to be entrepreneurs themselves. And specifically, we see those in the US terms now in the form of ecosystem builders. So a lot of those individual people who are really, like, regardless of their organization where they work, in a support function, in a bank, in a government organization, or in an incubator, they go way beyond their own, like, official job or role, very entrepreneurial, wanting to support and develop the ecosystem, regardless of what the organization where they work is doing. And of course, they try to make that organization to do more as well. But even if they change the job, they most likely don't change their focus on entrepreneurial focus to develop the ecosystem. So, but these are more individual people rather than organizations. And and then other ecosystem stakeholders. So these are policymakers. They are those who have influence and they have impact for ecosystem, but they are not necessarily actively operationally engaged. Development financiers and so forth. So a startup, if we look at the startup ecosystem, also a bit more to summarize, the startup ecosystem is formed by people, startups, in their various stages and various types of organizations in a location, typically physical, a city setting, or a virtual that can also, of course, be built online, but it's a different shape, interacting as an organic system to create new companies. And different organizations typically focus on specific parts of the ecosystem function and or startups at their specific development phases. And when we look at the interaction between the startups and ecosystems, is that startups develop in startup ecosystems through the development phases in a constant interaction with various organizations, services, and people. And the more dynamic, transparent, and balanced the ecosystem is, the more successful startup ecosystem the startups ecosystem can create. So there is a really this symbiotic relationship between these two, and of course there are also people who change roles from being an entrepreneur to being a mentor to becoming back an entrepreneur to becoming an advisor to going back to being entrepreneur to coming back as an investor. So there's a lot of fluidity overall in the ecosystem to understand. Maybe I stop here to check if there's any questions.
We haven't got any question on the chat, Balto.
All right. So just want to say to everyone that I know sometimes it can be a lot, but at the same time, I encourage you, if you have questions on your own notes, feel free to share those in the chat and we can cover those. But if not, we will just continue on the webinar. So When we look at the startup ecosystem and the services in the more practical sense, we want to kind of showcase the problem from two different perspectives. And this is more like the real life, often startup entrepreneur or other individual people navigating the ecosystem, and then looking from the perspective of support organization providing the services. So a typical view from customer's perspective, so whether I'm a new talent with an idea or whether I'm already a startup entrepreneur pushing my venture forward, but coming from maybe another ecosystem, from moving from one city to another or so forth. The confusion is that even if you know how to read ecosystem, like you know who is who and what is organization, what do they typically do and so forth, but even let alone not having that, the typical challenge that you can come across is that there's a lot of organization and they also have multiple different services, and oftentimes those services may be outdated, still available but not available, so still on the website but not available. Oftentimes, because everyone wants to be helpful, they tend to cater for, we do this and this and this, and we also do this and this. But when you really look at, maybe 80% of that goes to one service specifically, or top three services. So oftentimes you may see organizations that try to do too much, they communicate too much, and they're not very clear of what actually they provide. And when you multiply this with the bigger the ecosystem, the more actors it is, the more confusing it becomes. And because of this, you can actually many times see that even these individual ecosystem builders, or those like really active individuals, they even as individual, they have tried solving this problem many times until they run out of resources or efforts, and then it quickly comes outdated. And so you can see kind of these ghost lists in many places where the information exists, but anyone who is familiar with the ecosystem can see, oh, that's outdated, oh, that's not anymore relevant, oh, that's so. And what happens when the next person who is very energetic and comes with the same problem? Well, they may try to replicate the solution, and they try to create a map, and they try to do it. Sometimes this happens as crowdsourced effort, and it is an important exercise, but there needs to be a continuum after that. It should not be repeated just for the sake of repeating, and typically in the same solution format by different actors, but not consistently making sure that the problem doesn't reoccur, and there is actually a solution that keeps improving and developing and is always up to date. So when we look at the support organization perspective, we can basically simplify any support function into a process where there's a service process of some kind, whether it's even if it's a startup event, you go there, you acquire knowledge, you acquire contacts, you come out and you have more knowledge and you have more contacts. So that was the process that you went in, that was the improvement that you get, let alone an advisory process or accelerator process or incubator process. But you really should look at that as a process. And in this support organization's view, we have customers coming in, experiencing the process, the service. It may be 2 hours, it may be 3 months, it may be 2 years to be in a support process, but that's what these services are about. Customers come in, typically the service people running the support function, they start from a perspective of where do you come from, who are you, where do you come from, what do you need, do you fit our service, and then once they engage that certain period of time, out they go, and oftentimes they have very difficulty to know what happens after that. For the companies, the more volume they do, the bigger this problem becomes. At the same time, there's the very limited visibility of what are the other ecosystem organizations in the ecosystem. So the similar limitation to see who they are, as oftentimes, even though working there for a longer period of time, that understanding starts to develop, but also in support organizations, people change. When people go, they may know. When new people come in, everything is again a new thing, needs to learn who are who and so forth. And there are many different customer journeys, so each of the startup may navigate different ways. So different paths, different roads. One may go through one path depending on industry or innovation and so forth. And the customer experience is really through this service is that they are not really connected. There's no clear path from one organization to another, and they need to navigate through. They may not even know about all of them. Oftentimes to support people, they may know a couple of relevant organizations, but not all of the ones. And sometimes even the entrepreneurs or the startups, when they come to support service, the startup themselves know better because they just came from an organization and they just heard what services are being offered and what are the new things that are coming. They may know more than the organization that they visit next, where they tell about this product and the next service may say, oh, I haven't heard about that. So there's a lot of this disconnectivity between the information flowing and the knowledge about the ecosystem services and actors happening. So in addition to that, there's a bunch of other challenges, multiple people with different needs, people from students to long-term civil servants, so very different profiles, multiple organization types with different core purposes. So some only focus on entrepreneurship support. We don't support startups, though we support innovation of all kinds and startups and so forth. Multiple support services and service processes for different targets. So really big variety, public, private, NGO, hybrid organizations and budgets. Oftentimes there can be project-based funding that allows to develop a service, and then it's run for 2 years, 3 years until the project funding ends. And even though it was working great and everyone liked, there is no continuum with that project, and a new project is created to get the organization funding so that the people don't lose their jobs. And it's just a confusing thing for many. Big, small, and growing companies, constantly evolving innovative environment, variety of terminology, entrepreneurial culture, many different tools used by different parties for different purposes, limited availability of real startup building experience. And this is exactly why we have created a digitally distributable, scalable curriculum. We have open source version of the whole curriculum, 900 slides, free to download from our website. We have the e-learning content, and we have a certification model for increasing the in-person startup building experience, training and knowledge share. Success is based on volumes of new unknowledgeable people joining. So basically meaning that not only new startups, but new people coming to become a policymaker, new people coming to support function, new people coming from corporate background to support startups as advisory, but not having experience of building something out of nothing, but experience of running an existing company, very different skill set. So really a lot of people that constantly would not only training the new talent, but really training everyone in the ecosystem repeatedly and ongoing basis in a scalable, repeatable manner in a consistent knowledge format. something that is not changing, something that is more evergreen and applicable over decades of time. Myths and wrong knowledge from startups and other regions. So consuming media perspective out of what's happening elsewhere versus then looking own ecosystem and thinking, well, our problems here are all unique, just for us, and elsewhere everything is working better. We should all understand that, and based on our experience of working with more than 30 ecosystems on the ground, we know that all the ecosystems are suffering from similar problems at different scale, excluding a couple of top leading ecosystems in the world that are in their own levels that cannot be replicated because there is no such capital available. But when we look at thousands and thousands of cities across the board globally, the problems are not unique. They are very similar, depending on the different maturity levels of what are the most relevant problems at the time, but they are very similar everywhere. There's no data sharing, there's no standard reporting, the KPIs and the metrics are random and not consistent year after year for comparability, for improvements and so forth. So the good thing about these challenges, of course, is that there's plenty of field to work with, a lot of practical things to start working on, and not only looking at how do we get more VCs, how do we get more investors into our ecosystem. There's much more practical problems to work on that are much more solvable and much more tangible.